Hello, welcome to the first video in the Persuasive writing series. That's Roxy Music from their 1974 album Country Life. Prairie Rose, one of my favorite songs. I'm also representing the alma mater. This is where I went to school. I thought I would get serious for talking about persuasion because that's very serious. So in fact, I should put on my glasses and look serious. So I got a series of videos here. Right now, I have plans for 5 videos. This is number 1 on overview and audience, and ending with a bang. Then the next video is on thesis, which is probably the core and the most important thing about a persuasive essay. At least that's what we teachers make it sound like. The third video will be about introduction and the rhetorical triangle, as there's no better time to think about a rhetorical triangle than when you're beginning your essay, and you may want to establish at least 2 of the 3 appeals right away. Video 4 is on paragraphing, so how to build out the whole thing with some structure. And then the final video, and my plan right now at least, unless I add more, is a video on counter arguments specifically. So let's get into it. And for this, I actually have a PowerPoint, which I don't normally do, but it seemed appropriate for this subject matter. Plus, I have a PowerPoint, so here we go. It's hopeful that the share works. I'm assuming. There we go. Let's make me bigger, and hope that you can see what I got here. I got my notes on one screen. I got you on this screen. So let's roll. This is officially parts of the research. Well, parts of the persuasive essay. Not necessarily a research paper, but it would work for a research paper too. Argumentative strategy and counter arguments. So I'm going to touch on those, even though I'm going to do a full video on them later. So very first thing really to think about when thinking about a persuasive essay is your audience, because you're writing to a reader. Though you're not writing a letter necessarily to a reader in which you write using the second person pronouns and directly address the reader, you're thinking about the reader because you have a goal in mind, and that goal is to persuade your reader on a particular argument that you want to make. And you're going to frame this argument in your thesis statement, and the whole essay is meant to advance that argument. And part of it is thinking about the arguments that your audience will make with your argument. They'll be like, hey, but what about that? And, well, I don't think you thought about this. Or your whole argument is whack because blah, So you got to think about what those things are, and so you have to specifically define your audience. And often student writers don't really think about their audience very much. They think about, well, this is something my teacher is making me do, so I guess my teacher is my audience because my teacher is the main person who's reading my work. And though that's true, that I am reading your work, I put myself in the position of the person or persons that you're trying to persuade, So it really depends on your subject. What are you writing about? So if I'm trying to convince someone that we should legalize gay marriage, then I'm thinking about those individuals that oppose the legalization of gay marriage. If I'm talking about how we should institute more gun control laws in our country to prevent mass shootings, I am thinking about those individuals that oppose gun control laws. And so know thy audience is the first thing to really start to wrap your mind around as you're developing your essay. And you analyze the beliefs and values of the audience that you're aiming your essay at. So you should visualize them and maybe even do a pre-writing activity in which you describe your audience. And so you think about who has the power to make the change that you're going to argue for, because any good persuasive essay is going to argue for a change. Usually they're structured around a problem solution type setup. In fact, I would argue that any argument paper can be conceived as a problem and a solution type setup. Pretty much everything that gets argued is arguing about some problem and changing the status quo of a particular problem. So you think about your audience. What is the reason for which they oppose you, like the protests that you see here? Is it a personal conviction? Is it based on their employment or some legal consideration? Is it based on their environment or their education? Or are there religious or moral values that prohibit them from agreeing with your point of view, such as my gay marriage example is a great example of that. Sometimes it's based on ease or effort. It's just easier for them to do what they're doing. It would take effort to oppose you. And so sometimes their point of view is based simply on ease or effort. But often money is involved. Money is a powerful motivator, and often people don't get involved or don't want to make a change because there's a financial stake in the situation. But whatever the reason or reasons are, you have to have an understanding of those, because you need to grapple with them and leverage them as you're making your argument. So let's look into this a little bit more deeply. First thing, of course, is there's some sort of opinion, thesis, claim, some sort of a statement of your argument. And usually in the classic academic structure of what we call the deductive reasoning structure, you put this at the beginning of your essay, usually as the last sentence of your introduction. So after you've set up some context, you grab the reader's attention with a hook, which I'll talk about more in my introduction video. You then narrow down to the final sentence of your paragraph to deliver a thesis statement, which I will go into depth about in the next video on thesis statements. But there's some other things that you want to think about, not only for the whole essay, but definitely at this stage of the essay, which is an appeal to emotions. Pathos is often best used right away. A strong hook can be one of emotional appeal, but you also want moments of emotional appeal throughout your essay to leverage the reader's emotions, especially if you can establish a link between your emotions and the emotions of the reader. You also need to think very much about your credibility and trustworthiness. You need to be reasonable and not hostile in how you write. That doesn't mean you have to write emotionlessly and without conviction and passion. You can be passionate, but you have to be careful in how you express your passions in an academic setting in particular, so that you don't come off untrustworthy and you're easily dismissed. So you want to sound credible, sound reasonable, but at the same time, have reasonable and credible sources that you're using as the support for your argument. Which brings us to the next thing, which is reasoning and evidence to your claims. On a very basic level, not even using what we call source material, good reasons persuade. So if you just have logical reasons for the argument that you're making, you're likely to persuade the reader because if they can see the good sense in your reasons, they don't have any reason to argue with you. If, for instance, they don't see the good sense in your arguments, or they have a fundamental reason to disagree with you, like in some of the cases I mentioned previously, there are going to be objections. In fact, some writers tell stories of waking up in the middle of the night, having thought of objections in the thing that they're writing for the reader, and getting up to fix the writing to deal with those objections, to be careful to incorporate those into the essay and do what we call refuting them, which is either beating them or finding a way to making it all work to continue to persuade, to sway, to convince the reader to accept your claim and take action. And then logical fallacies are mistakes in logic when you are not using reasoning very effectively. Now, I mentioned a few of these in this video, and I will talk about those in more depth in a later video. And then, of course, even though I'm going to talk about introduction, start strong. You gotta start really strong and grab your reader's attention, or they're not going to keep reading. And then you got to end strong as well. You got to end with a bang. You got to have a killer last line. So you really got to think about that as you're composing the essay, but you don't necessarily have to come up with a strong opening to start before you start writing. It'll evolve as you're working on it, just as your last line, your killer last line, will evolve as you're working on it. And you don't need to write the thing in order, because you can write out of order with a computer and move pieces around in the blink of an eye, which is a really, really great convenience of the modern world. So as you're constructing your thesis, and we'll go into more depth about this in the next video, but you need to clarify this claim. You know, a good claim has reasons. A good thesis has reasons and a call to action. And is structured, as I said, around a problem-solution type concept. There's this problem, and we want to solve the problem. So here's what we do to solve the problem, and you argue for that. We'll have some tests for the claim that we'll go through in the next video, but I did want to kind of just throw this out here so that it was basically set up. Then, do you have enough reasons to support your claim? Do you have reasons and evidence? Sometimes evidence can come in the form of a story, a personal experience. It doesn't have to necessarily be factual or come from a source. As with reasons, depends on what you're writing about as to how much source material, other people's writing you need to support your point of view. But if some of your evidence is faulty, you might need to corroborate it from other sources. For instance, I've often shared the example that say I'm writing about changes to concealed weapon permit law, and I want to make an argument that only 5% of the gun crimes committed nationally in the last 5 years were committed by individuals with permits to carry concealed weapons. So wrap your mind around that statistic. Only 5% of gun crimes in the last 5 years, out of all the gun crimes, so 95% were committed by individuals who were licensed to carry their weapon around in what we call, it's really open carry, but concealed weapon permit. So that they can have it concealed, they can have it open, depending on the laws of the state. Well, what if that fact is just kicking around my head? What if somebody told me that in a conversation and I want to use that in my essay? Well, I can't because it's not an established fact. I have to go hunting for a source that corroborates that fact, and then to make sure that that source that I have found is not biased and is telling the truth, I should try to corroborate it from a couple other sources. If we have two major news networks are CNN and Fox News, and they're diametrically opposed in terms of their point of view on a spectrum of liberal and conservatism. But if they both agree on a fact, if they both agree on a statistic, if they both agree on a thing that someone is saying is true, it's possibly true. It still could be proven false. But it's more likely to be true because both of them have personal reasons for wanting to prove the other wrong. And if they're not trying to do that, it's likely that they can't. So you have to evaluate your evidence. Is it timely? You can't use, that I can't use that statistic in my 5-year period, can't be 25 years ago. It's got to be now. I got to have comprehensive, evidence. So if that's just true for Rhode Island, that's not very motivating as opposed to the whole nation. And then credible, as I was just talking about. Can we believe the source that we have? You also have to think about your own beliefs. These are beliefs that underline your argument in a particular kind of argument structure known as the Toolman argument structure. These are known as warrants, and they're beliefs and assumptions you have as a writer that connect together your argument, your claim, your thesis with your data, your reasoning, your evidence, and they make those work together to form your overall argument that the essay is promoting. Well, what if the assumptions that you've based your writing on are not shared by your reader? That's something you absolutely have to address. You know, so because if your audience is, well, you're not a patriot, or you're not a gun owner, or you're not a Mormon, they're just going to dismiss whatever you're saying because it so diametrically opposes their own beliefs. So this is another reason to think about the beliefs of your reader, but also to think about your own beliefs to make sure that you're aware of them as you're propelling your argument forward. So it's very important to find shared beliefs and values between you and your reader. So back to my gun control example, usually everybody involved in that debate agrees with public safety. The most poignant example I can think of is the Sandy Hook Elementary Massacre, in which nobody, the people that want free gun laws and upholding of the Second Amendment and no control on the purchase and licensing of those that can have guns, agree that that shouldn't have happened. And we don't want to see that happen. We want to prevent that from happening. But then likewise, people that think the solution to that particular problem is to restrict gun ownership, they also don't want to see that happening. That's why they're arguing for restricting gun ownership. But both people believe in the public safety. And we can leverage this, depending on which side of that argument we're taking, to try to sway the others to feel as we do about and to take action. So you also have to present the opposing arguments fairly. You know, so as angry as you might get at people that oppose you, you can't lash out at them with hostile language. It doesn't make you look very good. You know, and I think well, I don't want to necessarily bait this video. There's some examples of that right now in the modern world. You also don't want to oversimplify the other position to make it look weaker and yours stronger. You know, so no straw men. You know, so a simple straw man for the gun argument is simply, oh, so we just take all the guns away. Is that what you're saying? We just take all the guns away and then we won't have these gun crime massacres. Well, that's an extreme oversimplification of the issue. You know, so don't oversimplify. Don't create a straw man that's just easy to knock down. Oh, well, I'm not saying that, so that's easy to deal with that really ridiculous counter argument, right? So several things you can do to oppose, to disprove the arguments of the opposition. You can question the claim. Is the oppositional claim overstated? Is it insufficiently supported? You can question the evidence. Does the evidence come from reliable sources? Is it accurate? And more than ever before, there is some great stuff being done in the world of media, looking very critically at sources and finding that people misrepresent data all the time. And then, like I was just talking about, questions the warrants and the backing. Are there beliefs and values and assumptions that are not shared, you know, that invalidate the opposition's point of view or that invalidate your own point of view, in examining that. So one thing that is good to do is to consider making concessions to the other position, because you can't argue them away. You say, well, I can accept that. I can accept that, you know, for instance, we have the Second Amendment. So, that guarantees gun ownership for very specific reasons. So I have to accept that, and lots of people use guns for very responsible things. So they're very responsible gun owners. And so I can respect that. And so often, if you don't just reject the objections, but you accept them, but make counter arguments to attempt to refute them, but we have a problem. We can't deny that we have a problem. And if you want to deny we have a problem, then that's an easy argument to negate, because clearly we have a problem with gun crimes in our country. So conceding some of the opposing arguments is a useful strategy. Appear fair-minded. Don't get backed into a corner. Being fair-minded, listening to the opposition, this is a very useful tactic in argumentation. So one thing to do as you're trying to wrap your mind around what you're going to write, rather than going with no plan whatsoever, is to consider the pro and con arguments. Now, most issues are complex, so complex that simply thinking of pros and cons is inherently flawed, because there's more than two positions usually to any issue. But as a simple brainstorming technique, to just think about simply two sides of what might be a very complex issue, this might help you to construct the points that you'll make to advance your argument. For example, let's take this situation in which there are individuals at a university who sell class notes. They run a business in which they send people to large lectures to take notes, sell them to students that aren't attending those lectures because no attendance is taken, and the tests that are given completely based on the lectures, and yet the motivation to go to those lectures is not high, especially given the number of students, lack of interaction with the professor, and the fact that there's no attendance being taken. So some enterprising business persons at universities make a fair amount of money by going to these classes themselves and selling their notes, sending other people, and running a small business. And so on one side, against the sale of class notes, it's unfair advantage for some students in some classes because they get these notes that they didn't take. Note-taking is a skill that some students need to develop. So if the student isn't going to these classes and taking the notes, not developing the skill of note-taking. Rich students can afford this luxury because they can pay to buy these notes, but the poor students are stuck going to the class and taking their own notes, and this creates an inequity which is not fair. Students do not learn to organize. Part of the whole process, not just taking notes, but it's organizing all the complex things the teacher says and understanding what is expected of you in the course, and then just also organizing the material that's being presented. Students skip class, and there should be consequences for that. And students need to think for themselves, so they shouldn't be purchasing the thoughts of others. On the other hand, for the sale of class notes, help students get better test and course grades. Their grades are better if they're benefiting from this system, particularly because some of these people aren't even enrolled in the class. They're going there to take notes, and maybe they've taken the class before. They understand what to put in the notes even better than the teacher is explaining. It actually helps students to learn and organize material because they get this very organized set of really high quality notes, and they can study from that and learn from that and do that for themselves when they can't take advantage of this service and they have to actually attend a class and take their own notes. Or what if students are normally taking their own notes, but they're ill and they can't attend? This way they can buy notes, and because often, even though professors are often supposed to be able to provide lecture notes. They can't do that. They're improvising. It's very difficult. And this can be a great service to those who have to miss a fair number of classes for really legitimate reason. Also, as I said before, students can really learn from looking at these notes because they're good models for how to take notes. You know, like look at these great professional notes. And look, gee, you know, often students don't have a lot of money. This is a great job for a student that needs money to either run this business him or herself, or be employed by someone who's running this business, right? And you'd be surprised at which side of this argument I would prefer to write an essay about. It's not what you think. Another thing to do, in addition to pro and con, is to think through the consequences of your thesis out to the natural conclusions. You know, and so you ask yourself, what are the conclusions you're forced to accept if you argue for your thesis? And so you do this with a series of if-then statements. So what does this look like? So, for example, if you argue that the death penalty is racist because most people on death row are black, then you're logically committed to arguing that any system in which a group is represented beyond demographic percentage is biased. So any system in which you got, in this case, more black people than other people, white people or other non-African American people of color, that system is biased. So therefore, the NBA is racist because it's predominantly, populated by African American men. And the death penalty is sexist against men, as almost everyone on death row is male, and very few people on death row are female. So that's a logical progression of what you have to accept based on your original claim. In this case, you have to be careful to acknowledge that not every system in which one group is represented beyond the demographic percentage is biased. But that this situation that you want to argue is biased, and you have reasons to argue for that bias. I hope you see what I'm saying. So countering objections serves to convince readers who happen to share those objections. And I've talked about this already, so this is just emphasizing that same point again. You're thinking about your reader who opposes your view, establish that healthy relationship, that common ground. Asking questions will in part help you to accomplish this goal. So you ask questions of yourself, not in the writing, but of yourself as you're composing stuff like this. So here's some diagnostic questions for you as you're constructing your argument. So very simply, what is your opposition's argument? Try to understand it without ridicule. What are just some basic objections to your point of view? And then the common ground thing I've talked about. You know, what would your reader most like to hear you acknowledge? You know, show understanding, acknowledge the other person's intentions. And then what do your readers most likely fear? Like, look at the gun example. You're going to take away my guns, you know, or, you know, like there's something that I use on a daily basis or something that I believe in. And then your argument threatens my belief system. You know, it's going to change my world, and I don't necessarily want that. I'm not sure what I meant here. Be reassuring. I know everyone's image of cheap bus travel. I don't know what I was thinking there. So we'll just, but being reassuring is good. And then how is the reader likely to dislike you for what you're saying? People resist being persuaded. So you have to try to be as reasonable as possible. Make disclaimers. You know, well, I'm not saying this. You know, just because I'm arguing, you know, that we need to make some changes doesn't mean that maybe I'm not a gun owner myself. You know, things like that. You want to avoid raising hackles, but at the same time, you want to write passionately. You want to be reasonable, but sometimes you can't just be nice to be nice. You have to be hard hitting. So you have to think about some things as you're working with your material. How do you know? Goes back to the belief thing. Where does this belief come from? Ask where you got the beliefs and the assumptions that you're basing your opinion on. What are the facts? If you don't have any facts, you're less likely to persuade, because facts lead to reasons and good reasons persuade. For everything you write, you have to be watchful to convert abstractions and generalizations into specific instances. Should always ask yourself, like what, such as, for instance, for everything that you're writing about. This is probably the most important thing I've said so far in this entire presentation. What should be done? If you're not arguing for a call to action, you're not really persuading, because then there's really no persuasion. There's no change. Persuasion is about change. Ask yourself what you want done and who you want to do it. That goes back to thinking about your audience. Somebody should do something about this, whatever your this is supported in that line of thought. How will it work? You just can't say this should change. You have to have some specific solution in mind. You might not have to think through every little nuance of it, but you have to be able to argue beyond just somebody should do something about this. It's got to be a little more than that. And you want to avoid what's often called black and white thinking, which is something I talked about earlier, is the oversimplification, the either or thinking. Either we, have no gun laws at all, and we just live with the mass shootings and try to stop them some other way, or we take away all the guns. And it's ridiculous. Nobody argues that. Maybe some people do, but they shouldn't. And so a little bit on some logical fallacies. One very common logical fallacy is called post hoc ergo propter hoc, which is very fancy Latin for after this, therefore because of this, which is basically boils down to what we would call faulty cause and effect reasoning. So, X doesn't necessarily cause situation Y just because X comes previously in time to Y. And this is something that people often do. It's like, well, if this came previously in time, then it must have caused this other thing over here. So legalizing gambling leads to crime. That's potentially faulty, because just because there's more crime after gambling's been legalized doesn't mean that the legalizing of the gambling caused that crime to exist. Violent video games increase youth violence. It's the same kind of thing. Just because young people have always been prone to violence. So video game consumption doesn't necessarily make that more true. And this one's a little more ridiculous. The Beatles caused a rise in teen pregnancy. That one's actually true. But joking. So is there a causal relationship? What are the other factors that could have affected the outcome? So that is a basic overview of thinking about persuasive writing. Come back for the next video in the series in which I talk about thesis construction, and then move on to other parts of the essay. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you around. Whoops.